Hello everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on managing supplier risk. My name is Joe Gehring and I will be your host today. In today's webinar, we'll introduce you to a 5-stage methodology that you can follow to better enhance your risk management and management process and your assessment process. So let's go ahead and start with just a few housekeeping items. We'll answer questions at the end of the webinar. We'll answer as many questions as we can in the hour that we have scheduled today. And if we don't get to your question, please rest assured that someone will follow up with you after the webinar. Ask your questions by using the Q&A feature in the WebEx toolbar at the top of your screen. Click the Q&A button and type your question to the host only. And I'll go ahead and be a little proactive and start by answering the most common question first. Yes, you'll receive copies of the slides and a link to the recording after the event. And now I am pleased to introduce our speakers today. Michael Cross, PhD, is the Senior Manager of Solutions Marketing for DirectWorks. The market analysis you'll see in the presentation today comes from his extensive training in research and analysis coupled with more than 20 years of software experience. Stacy Leidwinger is our Director of Product Management. She derives the product roadmap, market requirements, and product positioning. She works closely with our customers and partners to understand their sourcing and supplier management challenges. And now I'll turn things over to Michael.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. We have a very large audience today, and that is because we are seeing a significant rise in the need to better understand risk, especially risk associated with suppliers. When I think about what is driving this renewed focus on risk, I think about these 3 V's: visibility, volatility, and violations. The supply chain for manufacturers has become very long, going up a number of tiers. Without better visibility into the full path and picture of the supply chain, manufacturers are very concerned about what could lie ahead. Manufacturers also now live in a world that is very volatile. It's volatile in terms of demand, pricing, even availability of supply fluctuates greatly. Research shows that despite its importance, most companies feel they have significant gaps in their risk management processes. Why? Well, we feel the answer is pretty simple. Assessing, managing, and mitigating risk is a very complex process. There are hundreds of risk factors to begin with, each which requires detailed scenario planning, testing, and review. A lot of companies tend to pick out a few areas of risk that they want to manage well, leaving themselves very vulnerable in many ways. So why is this webinar different than others you may have attended? We are going to introduce to you a 5-stage methodology that helps you assess and manage risk better, both deeper and wider. We believe that in order to maximize effectiveness, you need to create a simple but repeatable and scalable process, a process that enables you to stay focused only on the activities you need to engage in to make a true difference. Here's our 5-stage model. The first stage is identifying and evaluating risks, followed by prioritizing risk, collecting and analyzing data, creating calls to action, and automating the workflow. So let's begin by looking at stage 1. This is an initial analysis phase where the data is often more subjective than objective. You start by discussing the definition of a risk event that your company is going to analyze. Here's a very broad definition. Why don't you just define risk as any factor that exposes you to potential loss? Yes, that's going to be hundreds and hundreds of factors, but that indeed is what we're trying to understand here. What factors could create loss? We often take all these factors and we break them into 2 big buckets, those related to suppliers and non-supplier risk, which can include things like commodity pricing, your own labor issues, logistics, market demand, and many more. On the supplier side, you have to focus not only just on first-tier suppliers, but all your upstream suppliers, as recent incidents in the market have proven that problems with the upstream supplier can bring your production line to a halt. Please note that for today's webinar, we are going to be focused 100% on supplier risk.
And Michael, this is one of the areas that I see a large uptick in people taking actions. Many people have been focused on their non-supplier risk, and they've actually gotten bitten by their supplier risk. So I suspect that's why we have the number of attendees we have today. People are looking to improve their supplier risk processes.
Good point, Stacy. So let's delve deeper into stage one. You can think of stage one as creating a simple spreadsheet. In column A, you would list out all the risk events you want to study at a high level. These could include things like a supplier going out of business, capacity issues, weather-related disruptions. Line items can be at an individual supplier level or at a macro level, like natural disaster in Southeast Asia. In column B, for each of the line items that you're going to study, you're going to estimate the probability that that risk event could occur from less than 1 to 100%. In column C, you're going to estimate the financial impact on your business if that event indeed occurs. So impact can be measured in a number of ways. Old school was revenue. Nowadays, people pretty much are measuring impact on income or profits. Then there's a couple new best practices or emerging best practices that we think you should include in your spreadsheet. The first is a series of columns that allows you to classify the type of threat each risk event possesses. For example, maybe that risk item might lead to a production stoppage, or maybe it could erode margins. It might be a legal or regulatory issue, or it could threaten your reputation, then impact sales. For each type that you're going to track, have a column that's yes or no, and simply, for every event, define the characteristics of that threat. And finally, and I think this is the secret sauce to building a strong risk management model, you really need to assess the ability to replace each individual supplier that you use. Now, you can't focus on all suppliers, so you're certainly going to focus on strategic suppliers and other suppliers that could create a significant financial impact. Make this the next column and do one column for every supplier that you want to track. Then, we often get asked, Michael, well, what is the roadblock to completing this spreadsheet? And people expect us to talk about the data, Stacy. The reality is establishing the right assessment team, which includes who's going to own the problem, is usually the biggest roadblock.
Michael, I completely agree. Not only is it a roadblock, it's often not the starting point, and it needs to be. You need to understand at the end of the day who owns these problems. Who's responsible for jump-starting the effort and carrying it through to the end? Often when it comes to risk, ownership gets passed around. Is it the quality team, purchasing team, product team? Or are you starting to look at your C-suite? Is it your chief risk officer, chief procurement officer, or CFO? In those lists, Michael, I haven't even begun to list every possible role within your organization that could touch supplier risk. The reality, though, is at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, all of these teams are going to be sitting in a room together, and they're going to identify what was the turning point, how do we mitigate the negative outcome, and finally, how do we prevent it in the future?
So let me interject some practices and best practices related to this concept of who owns risk. And in fact, where I'm going here is that it's really not about ownership, it's about who's going to lead risk and how are you going to drive it through your organization. Well, the first three are pretty common practices. It's well known that your company culture will dictate your attitudes towards risk. So as you're going down the path of improving risk management, you need to assess your company culture. I've worked at companies who were so risk adverse that they made very poor decisions. They felt their job was to drive risks down to zero. That is not what risk management is. There is always risk in business. You need to understand what risk you're taking and the probability it's going to occur and what the trade-offs are of mitigating that risk. Thus, the culture, you want to establish a trade-off culture as opposed to a we'll have zero risk culture. You need to designate a hands-on executive sponsor. This is very common nowadays. Chief risk officers, as Stacy made, there are companies that have 8 or 12 of them because they establish a chief risk officer for every line of business. You also want to designate analysts and project managers who are specifically assigned to assist with risk management processes. But you want to also have the business unit provide resources so that the business sense is being combined with the analytical and project management skills. Now we're talking about a couple of areas where we think are emerging best practices. Fourth, everyone owns risk, and it should be in everyone's MBOs. I'm seeing this more and more in performance plans, where every employee, no matter who they are, has a line item that says managing risk. And it gets kind of fancy or it can be kind of simple, but the bottom line is everyone's judged. Do you exceed expectations in terms of managing risk? Are you better than expected? Average, below average. And a low score should have a significant impact on raises and bonuses if you're managing risk poorly, or if you've done something that threatens risk for your company. But the last point really is how you shape a performance plan. It goes back to trade-offs. All of these NBOs need to focus on making the right decision and communicating, I'm taking upon this much risk because I believe the cost is appropriate. Or we're not going to go down that path because there's really a threat to the quality side by doing X, Y, and Z. So it's about making decisions, not about rewarding inaction.
And Michael, I think a lot of good feedback, but if my simple mind, narrow it down to one word, it all comes down to accountability. Who's accountable at the end of the day when everyone needs to own the challenges?
So now let's look at the second stage of the methodology, prioritizing risks. Now, I'm a data geek, so this is my favorite stage. This is taking all the data and knowledge that you gathered in stage one and plotting it on a heat map. And you're pretty familiar with heat maps. The x-axis, that's the probability of event from 0 or less than 1 to 100%. And the y-axis is the financial impact to your business if the event occurs, which is from, again, less than 1 to 100%. Now, we're going to make this map 3 dimensions, and we're going to get to that in a minute. The third dimension is going to be individual suppliers. So, some practices to keep in mind. Most companies have bought onto this first one. It's not about size of spend. You're plotting financial impact. Back in the good old days, the y-axis was how much I spent with a particular supplier. And people looked at suppliers they spent a lot of money with. Well, that turns out to be a mistake. First of all, a lot of high-spend suppliers are providing things like nuts and bolts, other basic fasteners, other items. It's easy to find a replacement. All right? It's not spend, but financial impact. Think about it this way. You may have a supplier that you spend a small amount of money with, but they're making a critical component. A component which, if it doesn't show up in your shop on time, is going to lead to a production line stoppage. So it's about financial impact, not size of spend. Second, you need to create a cross-functional team to quantify the data. You just don't dump it into the laps of analysts who don't have business knowledge. You get teams together, business side, analytical side, and together they help scrub the data, quantify the data, come to agreement on what the value should be. Third, and now we're moving up the chain in terms of decision making, priorities are set by the team, by different department heads working together, looking at the heat map, moving things around, redoing analysis, and deciding what's going to be critical. We're going to do that first. What's going to be high, what's medium, what's low. It's a collaborative process. It is not analysts or other risk managers setting the priorities. Then there's a couple of emerging best practices you need to look at. You can see there on the map, I have in the low probability block, high financial impact. I've extended the critical shade all the way over to the end. This is a lesson that was learned from the tsunami and other major natural disasters. Even though an event may be low in probability, if it happens and it has huge financial impact, well, you need to be able to model it. You need to be able to assess and come up with mitigation plans. So no longer is the critical and high just in the upper right of this 9-grid map here. You can extend it all the way over to low probability events, high financial impact. And finally, again, I think this is the secret sauce, you have to assess the ability to replace individual suppliers. That is truly a major aspect of risk assessment. Now, you can be a little broad with defining ability to replace the supplier. Maybe it's you're looking for a supplier in a particular region. Or maybe you define it as supplier X has a great price and high quality. How difficult is it for me to find an alternative who has a similar price and quality combination? All right? In the end, you're plotting 1 to 100, where 100 is very difficult to replace. 1 is easy to replace. You then cut it off, say maybe above 80%, or 80 points on that scale, and you put X's down. So those X's represent individual suppliers. You can see there's 2 in the critical section, 2 in the medium section, 1 in the low probability section. You obviously start with the critical ones, you work your way back, and you're going to start doing some of the risk mitigation practices we're going to talk about in a minute. So now let's move on to stage 3, collect and analyze the data. You've prioritized the risk factors you want to attack. Now you need to do a deeper dive. Yes, you need to collect more data. Yes, you need to do more sophisticated analysis. And now you have to think about what are the practices, the best practices that I got to employ during that stage.
Thanks, Michael. And reality is, before you begin any of the data collection or start reviewing your projects, as you pointed out, you really need to start at the end. At the end of the day, what are the final reports that you're looking to produce? In order to answer this, you first need to identify who needs these reports. Is it your supply chain risk officer, your chief procurement officer? Is it your buyers, maybe different groups across the globe? It's okay if the answer is yes to all of these individuals. But as a starting point, pick one role and start to identify their need. Let's say you take your chief procurement officer. Whenever they're looking at reports, what insights are they hoping to gather? How often do they want to review reports? Is the report intended to alert on risk escalation points? And how often does your officer expect to use the information he or she learns? How are they going to change the way they operate based on the data? By answering these questions, you start to learn how the data is used and also the value that can be derived. This same line of questioning should be used with every single user and role that needs this information. When you start answering these questions from every user, you start capturing that 360-degree view of the data that you're going to need for deeper analysis.
And one thing I want to interject, Stacy, is, and this comes back to culture. You want a culture where, the younger team members, the analysts, the project managers aren't afraid to ask the people who are going to really make the decisions, what information do you need me to get for you? What do you need in this report? Too many times we got too many reports. All we do is show we got reports, we have a meeting, everybody looks at the reports, and then the meeting's over and we move on. That's not what risk assessment is. That's not what risk mitigation is. So a good culture, you're always encouraging this idea that what information do I need to gather for you so you can do your job better and manage risk better?
Absolutely, and I think all of those practices is what takes you to the next step of collecting your data, which is really where you need to build your data picture. Now that you know what data you need in order to provide the right level of reporting and identify the right level of risks, you need to identify, what do I still need to collect? Here's the key, Michael. Even if you have the data you need to start asking the questions around how frequently do I need to collect this data? Whenever risk goes south, it goes south really fast. You need data that's timely and accurate to heed off those threats early and often. You also need to make sure you have the complete data set. I've worked with a lot of manufacturers and they say, yes, we have all the information we need. Supplier scorecard is a great example. We require that every supplier has a scorecard. Then you take one level deeper look and you realize every plant has a scorecard, but maybe not every individual group underneath that, and that's really what you need. You need to identify those missing pieces. Finally then, For the data you don't have, you need to identify who has the information and how can you collect it in a reliable and repeatable fashion. Is it data that the information that the supplier should be sharing with you? Is it information the quality engineer needs to be sharing when they're on site and on location? By understanding who can get the data or has the information, you can start building repeatable patterns to collect and store all of your risk-related information. The key, though, Michael, is it has to be consistent and repeatable. You can go back and generate the right reports when you have consistent, repeatable, and frequently updated data. Keep in mind, the data is only as good as those entering and collecting it.
Yeah, and another thing I would say is that it's pretty clear that the data gaps that a company has vary company to company. They can be opposite ends of the spectrum. But one gap that we're definitely seeing very consistently is a gap in understanding visibility into the higher end of the supply chain, especially as you get further and further from Tier 1 suppliers. That's a data gap that definitely everyone seems to have, and it's one that needs to be filled.
So, Michael, the next step after this is, now that you've identified what data you need and who's going to be using it, now you need to start really generating analytics. We've talked about reports, but at the end of the day, it's the analytics that you need to gather and have in your hands so you're making the right trade-off decisions. The right trade-off around, do you allow risk to exist? Do you address it? What is the cost? We all know risk is always going to exist. The question is, to what degree and at what cost? By generating the right analytics and giving users readily access to the information they need for decisions, you can run a very rich risk analysis program. Executives and users should not have to ask the question, where is our risk? But rather, do I want to consume that risk right now or take action? Users need this visibility so they can start building out what-if scenarios. If this happens, what does it mean to my business? An example, and I think we're going to talk more about it in a few minutes, is around supplier capacity. If you know you have an issue, someone's missed capacity, what's going to be the result? Is it loss of revenue, loss of a customer, negative impact on brand? The question is then, what do you want to do to consume that cost to go ahead and mitigate that risk? Maybe you want to go and dual source to a more expensive supplier, run more frequent on-site capacity checks. And then there's always the option to do nothing. But make it an option. Make it a conscious decision that you're not going to address that risk element, not something that negatively impacts you later on and you realize it was an oversight. And I keep harping on this, Michael, but in order to have the right analytics, you need to have timely access to that information. It can't be a report that shows up on your executive's desk once a month, once a quarter. It needs to be visible and it needs to be live, that someone can check throughout the day, because risk is always changing. Analytics need to be updated continually to provide your team the most relevant and accurate set of information so they can make the right decisions when they need to make those choices.
So let's take a look at some best practices and emerging best practices. And really the three at the top are the emerging best practices. Risk assessment and management is now a year-round activity. It is not something that's done annually or either twice a year. You need to be doing it year-round, even more so than when you do a particular sourcing event. Year-round, every day, you're trying to identify the right fact base and gather the data you need to move this around smoothly. Second, and this is very much pertains to supplier capacity, the days of asking your suppliers to fill out a risk assessment form and you take their inputs as gospel and put them into your system are gone. Now you're just gathering data from your suppliers, and you're going to use the data to crunch your own numbers, to make your own models. Maybe that's about their capacity, that you believe what their capacity is. Maybe it's your rating of their financial health. It could be a wide variety of things, but you need to gather the numbers from suppliers, crunch the data yourself to come up with some really good modeling. You need to eliminate those upstream data gaps. You need to have Tier 1 suppliers really reach out to their higher stream suppliers and get visibility as well. Don't forget to integrate third-party data when you can. Just to remember that you need to sync the timing of the data. Always ask them, so how current is your data, or what's the time period of your data? Sometimes some parties have a rolling 12 months, and that can be very different than the time period that you're matching that data to. And finally, the oldie but goodie, quantitative data beats qualitative data every time. Try to get data that comes out of systems that you believe is really accurate, as opposed to, as you're doing this deeper dive, subjective. Subjective's okay when you're early on, kind of saying, well, which of these should we look at? When you're really drilling down and trying to assess risk, you need quantitative data. That takes us to the fourth stage of our methodology, and to me, this is the stage that separates those that are going to win from those who are going to lose. If you do this stage well, you will take leaps and bounds in terms of risk management. Stacy?
Yes, Michael. When I meet and talk with manufacturers, I've seen some really rich risk management programs, and I'm very excited that they're following the 3 stages we just outlined. And then all of a sudden my heart sinks. They're forgetting this most critical step: create calls to action. This is the critical step because this is how you're going to identify and monitor over time what needs to be done and the success of your program. So the steps for calls to action is, first, identify the action required to mitigate risk. You've already acknowledged this is a critical risk item. You need to make change. Identify what that change is. Now start to assign individuals to actions. As you talk about leadership, this isn't one of those action steps everyone can own. Someone needs to lead this initiative. You also need to be able to report on the deliverables and show progress. This is something that needs to come up in your weekly meetings, quarterly meetings, all based depending on what that risk element is. And finally, incorporate learnings to ongoing supplier risk activities. Ensure that that risk doesn't come up again. How can you prevent it in the future? How can you address it maybe even sooner before you see any type of impact? When organizations follow these steps for their calls to action, I see a lot of success that they're able to drive throughout their company.
And we're going to go through an example, and the word's going to be on the next slide, but there's one dominating word that you should remember about call to actions. It's predetermined. When we're talking about call to actions, we're talking about actions that you've determined before the risk event happens that you are going to take. Not you see the risk event happen, oh, now let's scramble and find some actions. So this is predetermined. There's a predetermined trigger. There's predetermined actions, and the only thing that's not predetermined is the decisions you're going to make, or the decision you're going to make based on the analysis when you're doing the actions. So here's an example: supplier capacity. There's a dashboard out there that tracks capacity levels for every supplier. When an individual supplier reaches 80% capacity, the light turns red. That's a trigger. When that happens, 3 projects are immediately launched. The first project is for an account executive. They're going to travel out to the supplier, and they're going to begin discussions on, do you have any plans to expand capacity? Are you going to be doing any investments into your business? Do you have any productivity gains? Are you holding back on capacity? Have you not added a 3rd shift? You're going to have discussions about, can you change your capacity number on your end? At the same time, people on the demand side of the business are going to be asked to confirm very current and very, in the near future, demand numbers. Because the last thing you want, Stacy, is sales and marketing doing high fives and cartwheels that they're knocking the cover off the ball, but they never bothered to update their demand forecast. You're going to run out of capacity even sooner, so you want to stay on top of that. Then there's a 3rd project that was automatically launched when supplier capacity reached 80% for supplier X. That is, the sourcing team launched a sourcing event, an RFQ, to explore if there was another supplier out there that could lend a hand. And now we see this more and more. People are talking about dual sourcing. And it's not going to be 50-50. Maybe it's 80-20, maybe it's 90-10. But they're looking at, can they find a supplier, good quality, affordable margins, that they could slip into the production process to help address capacity. A number of weeks will go by. All three of these projects will be done simultaneously. The team will get together, do a review, and in this particular decision, they decided, you know what, we got to take it upon ourselves. We need to do a dual sourcing award here. And we're going to give it 80-20 to two different suppliers. 80 to the current supplier, 20 to the new supplier. Again, the most important thing to remember is triggers and actions are predetermined. They are already built out, and as you see, preferably automated.
And I think, Michael, the big key here, too, is we're not talking at a single scale necessarily when you're creating these calls to action. I've seen a lot of manufacturers start to go against some of their lean principles, which had started to narrow down and simplify the number of suppliers, and now saying we need 60 to 70% of our business to be dual sourced. So I think a critical step is don't think of this necessarily as one person's task as they start to identify action. You need to think about, should this be magnified globally, across the organization, across product lines, regions, teams?
Yeah, and so what's changing in the industry is I'm not just going to save money by giving higher volumes. I'm going to improve my sourcing process and my leverageability, and I'm going to go out there and I'm going to find multiple suppliers who can deliver the quality I want at the right price. And that's where you gain the advantage. So let's look at our last stage. You know, I know you're sitting out there saying, didn't he say this was going to be simple? Well, the 5 steps are simple. If you go through the process steps, you can master those as well. But what you really need to do to make this thing fly, to be more efficient and more scalable, is automate things. So Stacey's going to talk about that.
And Michael, earlier you said you were a data geek. This is where my geek side comes out in how do we use tools and technology to automate these type of processes. The key here is assessing risk can't be a one-and-done activity. It has to be constant with as little manual effort as possible. Every manufacturer is going to have their own risk assessment workflow, but the key driver to success, and where I've seen the most success, is when those processes are automated. It can't be labor-intensive. If it's labor-intensive, you fall back into bad habits of looking at risk once or twice a year. It needs to be ongoing. At a high level, the 5 areas you need to consider automating is first, that data collection. How do you collect the data in an automated data store and ensure that you can use it for reporting? Second is the analysis. You need a way to automatically analyze the data without someone heavily manipulating risk information inside of a spreadsheet or multiple spreadsheets. By automating those steps, you now can have automatic alerts. If at any time an area of risk reaches above a threshold, the alert can go out, notifying everyone that risk is high and action may be required. This goes into launch calls to action. Now, as much as I love automation, I know you're going to have some steps that are manual, and this often comes in the calls to action. For example, if the risk is a supplier started production without a formal PPAP processing, an automated action might be confirm the data is true and the PPAP data is actually missing. If the answer is yes, then you may manually need someone to get on site immediately and perform that PPAP. The last step, though, is then verify the actions are complete. Once you've created the actions, ensure that regardless of what they were, manually, automated, that they're going and verifying that it's complete, and by verifying the completion, that risk level should go down and be marked as resolved. Now, the real beauty and key to automating all of these activities in order to scale with efficiency is integration of your data systems. Information is constantly flowing in and out of your company from your ERP systems, sourcing applications, supplier management, PLM, even third-party data sources. A good automated supplier risk process will integrate all of this information into a single application, eliminating the need for users to hunt and peck for the right information and miss critical data points. So we have reviewed the methodology in the 5 stages. Now, what we want to spend a little bit of time talking about is some additional factors that you need to keep in mind. The first is seeking continuous improvement. As you start automating your processes, as you start building out your methodology, don't forget that the supplier landscape is always evolving and changing. Your risk assessment process needs to adapt with these changes. A best practice is to review your process and outcomes at least quarterly. Review with key stakeholders from cross-functional teams. Ask them what is and isn't working. Ask users of these systems and tools, are they making your life easier? Are you avoiding problems that you otherwise wouldn't have avoided without these process and tools in place? Michael, I always say process for the sake of process never sticks, but good process evolves and grows with the business. Now, the second factor is really around justifying budget. I suspect that almost everyone on the line completely agrees that managing supplier risk is a necessity. And I bet many of you are thinking, there's a lot of areas I could improve in my own business. And then that big, ugly word of but comes in. But how do I justify budget? When it comes to justifying investment, here are some areas I've seen manufacturers leverage when they're building out their risk assessment budgets. First, go back and assess past issues. What did the company lose by not addressing risk in the past? Was it revenue? Have you resulted in lost customers, reputation, lost opportunities? Also, benchmark your competitors and related industries. There's a lot of information out there and that quantify the impact that negative situations bring. Think of the tsunami in Japan. There's numerous studies on what that did to manufacturing and what financial loss and hit companies experienced. There's also qualitative. You can't have qualitative without quantitative, but qualitative can be used. There isn't a boardroom in the world that isn't talking about how to improve the customer experience and retain customers. Articulate in a qualitative fashion. If you don't address this risk, what impact does it have on your customers? Is it a shortage that they are going to experience? Is it poor quality of products? Is it late delivery? And then the final area, depending on your needs that you may want to investigate, is around compliance. This is an area where some hard dollars can get spent if there's regulations not adhered to and fines are issued. This is one, Michael, where I see many customers and manufacturers get hit when it comes to their second, third, and fourth tier suppliers.
Yeah. The other thing I'd say about justifying budget is that, yes, you need to be able to tell stories, but you also need to be able to back up stories with, and here's what it could mean to us, and have some hard numbers. I've seen too many companies go in and just tell stories. Hey, did you see Fiat lost $500 million? Hey, did you see so-and-so got fined $20 billion? All right, it's not about telling stories. It's about quantifying the risk at a high level, subjectively, during the budgeting process to say, you know what, we need to be looking at this.
And I think you hit on their personalization. Throughout all of this, you need to be personalizing it for your organization. It doesn't matter what happened to Fiat. What does it mean to me?
So let's then look at the final key drivers of success. And this is somewhat of a summary of what we've been talking about. It starts at the top. You need to establish a good culture. You need to have a good, strong leader, and they are going to create a collaborative environment of people with different skills and really drive through a common cause. Again, it's about making trade-offs. Risk is everywhere. Every business faces risk. You can't eliminate risk in most cases. You can only mitigate it, assess how big the risk is and what the impact is, and decide, are you willing to take on that much risk or spend money? It's usually spend money to mitigate such a risk. But it's all a trade-off. It's not about risk avoidance. It's about risk management. The skill sets of the team that you're going to hire, I think you've all realized is going to be different starting this decade and going forward. You need more people with analytical skills. You need people with good project management skills. I like to put it this way. You need people that can talk trade-offs, who are comfortable explaining, well, if we do X, here's the benefits, here's the risk, here's the trade-off. I can quantify it for you. When you're doing interviewing, talk about trade-offs. Ask them to describe trade-offs they've made in their life. Can they communicate the concept of trade-offs strongly? That's a great skill to have. You got to build dashboards, you got to build scorecards, but apply the practices we talked about today. Do you have good triggers that are going to immediately trigger actions? You know, that's the scorecard, the dashboard, that's where the trigger turns red. Everything needs built out after that. And please, integrate as much data as you can. You don't want people entering things more than once. You don't want suppliers doing it, secondary suppliers doing it, employees doing it. Try to integrate your data into a common system. Maybe it's your sourcing system, supplier management system, a place that is already managing lots of data. Try to integrate it in there and just collect the right fact base.
And Michael, I think the number one thing that I hope people do not forget as they walk away is everyone owns supplier risk management. If you're sitting on the line today and thinking, this is all interesting but not really in my purview, it should be. And you should be thinking about how you can talk to your colleagues about improving and leveraging some of these best practices. As we move into the final section of our presentation, please type any remaining questions into the Q&A panel. But before we turn to Q&A, I want to remind everyone that if your organization is in the process of looking how to manage supplier risk, and you're looking for tools to automate not only the risk process, but other related activities such as sourcing and supplier management, please check out the DirectWorks website. We at DirectWorks are focused on helping streamline supplier management and sourcing activities through our cloud-based software. Our customers have seen significant reduction in things such as total cost, reduced risk, and overall improvement in new product launches. You can also follow us for additional thought leadership in our LinkedIn group, Direct Materials Insider, as well as Twitter at DirectWorks Inc. So with that, I think we're ready to open up the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Michael and Stacy. As a reminder, if you haven't already done so, ask your questions by using the Q&A feature in the WebEx toolbar at the top of your screen. Click the Q&A button and type your question to the host only. I have some questions here, so we'll start with this one. I agree with the methodology. The challenge we have is assessing financial risk for private companies located in the Western world or smaller Asian suppliers. I have been unable to find a reliable data source. Do you have any recommendations?
Yeah, I'll take that one. That's a great question. I've been having more and more discussions with different firms, Dun & Bradstreet, LexisNexis. They all do different things. I will be writing a blog after the ISM conference, which is just next week. I am going to actually tour the floor looking at these providers, ThomasNet, others, and I'm going to put those types of questions to them because it comes down to helping you understand the second tier, third tier, fourth tier, fifth tier suppliers. You're going to get good information on first tier suppliers, but the biggest data gap is on the upper tiers. So that's a good question. It's a question everyone's asking, and we have an opportunity next week to walk up to these vendors and say, give me a demo, and we'll share that in our blog on directworks.com in a few weeks.
Thanks, Michael. The next question. We don't have an established risk management system in our company. It seems like most of the risks are managed ad hoc. As an analyst, how can I propose, organize, and establish a report model?
You can go first, Stace.
Yeah, I think the big key there is, a lot of the steps that we talked about, I think you do need to build out the model because you need to be able to drive consistency around what is the data you're going to collect, how is the data going to get used, what is the analytics, and once you've identified the requirements, the model, the need, then you can start looking at systems. And I think a big key as you start looking at tools and systems is configurability and flexibility because your processes are going to change. They are your processes. So you need a tool that is going to fit and align with your processes, not try to take your processes and fit into their system. It needs to be easily accessible throughout every nation, so something that's going to be accessible as you work with Asia, North America, Europe. So these are all things to start considering when you start looking at these tools. At the end of the day, you need something that can automate your workflow, collect the right data, and perform the right level of analysis to drive visibility.
Right. And in terms of getting buy-in, because it sounds like this is that situation where the analysts actually have a better understanding of the concept than maybe senior management, so maybe the culture's not there. This is the trick I always use for getting buy-in. Don't try to convince them to adopt the whole methodology. Make that first spreadsheet, that simple one I talked about for assessment. Put down a bunch of risk factors. Start building it out. Start producing a heat map. People will come to you, and they will start changing your heat map. They will start adding things to your heat map. They will want to get their risk on your heat map, all right? And so don't worry about the later stages if you don't have the culture that says, let's build it from scratch. Start by just making a picture, creating awareness around risk at your company. And then when the timing's right, recruit your manager to say, hey, we should build upon the assessment and tie it to what should we do next. So if you don't have that from the top drive, you build up from the bottom by creating that heat map. That heat map will get you a lot of good visibility. And will come with a little bit of heat. Somebody might not like being on your heat map, but you get the discussion started.
Absolutely, Michael. I think the key to that is, as we've been talking about, make sure your data is correct.
Yeah.
Because if you don't have the culture, you have really one shot at getting it right, which means that you can't be crying wolf when it comes to risk. You need to have the right information and do your homework up front.
Thanks, Stacy and Michael. A lot of good questions coming in. So the next one, what types of risk are manufacturing companies managing well, and which ones do you think they're struggling with? What is the biggest threat you think companies are ill-prepared to face?
So I'll pick my favorite. It's upstream visibility. All right. They don't understand. They don't know the names of the Tier 3 and Tier 4 suppliers. I remember when the tsunami hit, there's a great example out there that one of the CPOs called all of his sourcing people on a big call, and they reviewed their Tier 1 suppliers, and none of their suppliers was in the tsunami region. And then someone, at the end of the celebration, said, gee, do you think any of their suppliers are in the tsunami region? And just terror set in, that they realized that their suppliers are just one step of the path. So clearly, not knowing the names of your Tier 2, 3, and 4 suppliers, that's blindness, and that has to be erased. To me, that's the biggest gap.
And I think I agree with Michael, and I think a lot of things, people are making the right steps, but I think sometimes the steps are not consistent. So here's another great example. It's been a hot topic, which is around capacity. We've mentioned it today. So I've seen where a lot of organizations have lacked strong supplier capacity programs and are now starting to implement it. So they've created these great supplier capacity spreadsheets, and they have a single location on their file share or sitting in SharePoint to store them away. But there's no way to actually report and identify that across your globe, this is the total capacity that we're working with this supplier. So when we go to source, we understand the supplier's already at 70% capacity. We would max them out if we added something new. So I see the right steps being taken, data starting to be collected, and now it's really the next step of how do we start to analyze all of that information. I mentioned capacity. Another area I've seen great improvements is around environmental factors because of things like the tsunami. But I think there's a lot more on the minor side as you start thinking about your second, third tier suppliers. What are their quality processes? Do they align with your own quality processes? Conflict minerals is one that many have struggled. They understand their first tier suppliers, but they really don't know if their third tier suppliers are adhering to some of the policies and practices that are out there.
And one last point I'll make, we're talking about supplier risk. So a real big gap exists in measuring risk associated with demand volatility. There's huge demand volatility out there, and it, in many cases, is the number one priority for manufacturers, is to try to estimate and predict demand better because they're really struggling to keep up with the gaps, or rather the spikes in demand. And it used to be much flatter. Now it's up and down, up and down, up and down.
Well, great. Those are the questions that we had today. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. Please complete the exit poll when you close WebEx and give us your honest feedback. And watch your inbox for copies of the slides and a link to the webinar recording within 48 hours. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining.